we need to talk about the New Age to alt-right pipeline, also known as the crunchy to tradwife, the woo to Q, or whatever you want to call it. My personal favorite is the woo-anon, because this cultural trend threatens to hack some of our cultural thoughts and positions as a movement towards traditional knowledge and land connection, and encasing this material into some really harmful stuff. So this is the Nordic Animism channel, where we are working to strengthen and explore the possibility for cultural paths towards decolonial, non-nationalist self-understandings for people of European descent by making available elements of traditional knowledge and reflections on how to position Euro-traditional knowledge in ways that insist on kindness and respect in cultural politics. And you can support us through Patreon, through the web shop, or you can find my online courses on Nordic Animism. So pipelines are cultural spaces where people move from one kind of culture and into another. As indicated by the name, the New Age to alt-right or woo-anon pipeline converts people from these sort of left-leaning alternative counterculture positions like spaces of New Age, yoga, eco-spirituality, and into strongly right-leaning positions, where climate change is a hoax, where queer sexuality is a threat to masculine energy, and where Donald Trump take up some sort of holy status. In this pipeline, you also find eco-hippies whose initial desire was to become self-sufficient and return to the land, but that sort of funnels them into this sort of tradwife movement. So I really think that we need to protect some of those important or even urgent cultural elements that are presently under threat of being kind of sucked into this broad, fluffy bullshit vortex. Important to say that there's nothing inherently bad in reading Jung or doing yoga or being interested in holistic health or herb medicine, practicing psychedelic spirituality and so on. In fact, I even recommend some elements that are also found in the pipeline, like wanting to move closer to nature or desiring some level of food sovereignty, thinking outside of norms, or being generally anti-authoritarian. But the woo-anon pipeline puts these elements into this really horrid cultural machine where they end up actually funneling people into the alt-right, paradoxically at times under some sort of pretense of being non-political. And I'll get back to that sort of bag of shite there. Part of what I find so scary about this woo-anon pipeline, part of perhaps why it should be a bit of a wake-up call, is the surprising accuracy with which it replays some of the precondition of early 20th century Nazism. So, Nazis were into romanticist nostalgia, traditionalism, ethno-nationalism, weird ideas of lost Atlantean prehistoric civilization that explain everything, fascination with Eastern spirituality, particularly Hinduism or Tibetan Buddhism, claiming that the Indo-Europeanness of stuff is really the important thing. Fascination with witches and paganism, with Western esoteric traditions, loads of conspiracy thinking and all that, natural healing, herb medicine, holistic health practices, yoga, anti-waxing, and even also elements that I would say are central to the Nordic Animism movement, like, for instance, critiquing parts of modernity like loss of community, loss of connectivity with nature and with our life sustenance, and therefore looking towards nature-based agriculture. Today we have the regenerative movement. They had the biodynamic movement that was important to the Nazis. They were also into decolonial thinking, would you believe it? And you could even find gay rights proponents in their ranks. Now, my point here is not to just smear Nazism all over the place in order to delegitimize everything, but just to make one really important point. And that is that countering the woo-anon pipeline that leads into fascism, begins with one really important step, and that is to never allow ourselves to sort of float into this wide-eyed, happy space where my thoughts are saving everything and can't do bad shit to the world. That is delusional. Never think that your thoughts are immune to fascist appropriation. This is part of the reason I'm making this video. I simply refuse that naivete. I don't know how many little Wuanese are listening in out there. And this, by the way, is part of the reason that we need to grow up to the realization that being non-political is not viable. It's simply not there. And I'll get back to that part of shite. But the accuracy with which the Wuanon pipeline matches the cultural kettle that birthed Nazism is just scary as hell. So please wake up and take this seriously. We need to 1. Counter this pipeline. 2. Avoid ending up in it ourselves. And 3. Figuring out how we help those of our friends that are in it. And I don't have the answer, so please chip in comments with your thoughts, and let's perhaps get a bit of communal thinking going here. I did an interview with Derek Beres, who from the Conspirituality podcast at some point, and some of the stuff that I'm presenting here is kind of inspired by my talk to him. But I will go through a couple of elements that I personally think are defining for this New Age to outright Wuanon space, and elements that I think we have to work with in order to counter this pipeline, this movement. These elements are counterculture, handling knowledge, trickster playfulness, and live in-person knowledge sharing. Cool, I'm going to start with counterculture. Remember the most iconic example of a counterculture voice who went down the pipeline, the English actor Russell Brand. So he made his name on the left-wing internet back in 2013, rooting for a revolution. Everybody loved his charm and intelligence and radicalism, as Brand expressed his disillusion with the liberal democracy and said, "There's gonna be a revolution." Boy, was he right. Just not the revolution that we and Brand at the time were hoping for, because Brand went and became an influencer. And he was sitting there with, his beanies and his lotus positions and his incense. He moved over COVID conspiracies. At some point he spoke to Jordan Peterson, who at the time himself was in some sort of transition between angrily cultural conservative towards actually losing his marbles. Peterson pulled some of his Jungian stuff there, played his father figure card, and over some talks he converted Brand to Christianity as the obvious national conservative position. So very much in line with the pipeline, Brand's motto was "Stay free." And a focus on freedom and individualism is actually one of the meeting points between the New Age positions and the alt-right. So smoothly over time, Brand pretty much ended up on the alt-right, hailing Donald Trump as an American prophet. So much for staying free, a lackey of the fascist regime. Now that is a full Wuanon pipeline trajectory. And throughout this entire path, counterculture is a through line. Importantly, Russell Brand always had some sort of trickster playfulness about him, actually, and I've spoken about this elsewhere. I think it is a cultural space that the alt-right has sort of hacked from the political left. For instance, there was a point where he only assumed conspiracy theories as a joke. It's true. I remember him saying at some point early in his process that the idea of transmorphing Martian reptilians was just so hilarious that as a stand-up comedian, he'd obviously had to go for it. So it's a joke, right? But notice how this playful joking around was actually at the opening of the pipeline. That is very trickster-like. Notice also how benign or even important element like playfulness, freedom, counterculture becomes levers for this transformation into fascism. Alright, so I'm going to talk about knowledge. where, surprise, surprise, the QAnon pipeline is characterized by a near-complete disregard for knowledge with integrity. In other words, people just suck up bullshit information. And a really iconic example of this is the phrase, "do your own research," which in this very trickstery fashion actually means exactly the opposite of what it says. It totally doesn't mean start doing research, which would mean read scholarly publications, collect and analyze data with methodologically tied procedures, and have it peer-reviewed. That is doing research. But no, in online spaces today, do your own research pretty much means go read some random Reddit posts, mirror them through your own social media, and when you're bored, pull out your Android and listen to the latest quack interviewed by Joe Rogan. I'm sorry, my brother, that is the opposite of doing research. But the present collapse in knowledge integrity is sometimes called the post-truth era, and it's characterized by this wild proliferation of bullshit, where anybody can pretty much say anything about anything and it'll be kind of considered legitimate. And this leads to one of the most important antidotes, I think, against QAnon fascism, and that is to insist on a culture of respecting knowledge. And that includes the Western knowledge tradition. Tyson actually suggests some kind of alignment between indigenous knowledge systems and scholarship. And perhaps we could see scholarship academia in part as almost the closest thing that we have to an actual indigenous knowledge tradition. And respecting knowledge, that means respecting how it works, how its foundation. And this leads to an aspect of the post-truth knowledge collapse that Derek Beres made me aware of, and that is a focus on affect, emotion. It is clickbait driven. For instance, I was in one of these conversations that many of us have probably tried, where horror-struck I opposed the choice of the pseudo-archaeologist, arch-bullshitter Graham Hancock, who has been labeled the conspiracy theorist's favorite historian. Now, he peddles these entertaining but deeply harmful ideas of lost Atlantean prehistoric civilizations that explain everything. And in this conversation, it came up that Hancock's writings were simply captivating. In other words, their appeal is emotional and immediate. But take good care when you react to something like that, because people will often feel patronized, and that reaction actually risks affirming the sense of counterculture that keeps people in the pipeline. The pipeline is already driven by emotion, by being captivating, clickbait, not by knowledge integrity. So knowledge-based arguments, they just don't cut it. The pipeline seems driven by this sort of emotional push-back dynamism that makes it difficult to argue, basically. And it can be difficult to not get emotional. You know, I was told at some point that the Ashkenazi Jews devised the COVID pandemic to steer clear of their evil Ashkenazi DNA. And my first reaction was shock. And, dude, you're telling me that you are a neo-Nazi? And then the reaction is characteristically, moi? How dare you box me in and label me as right-wing? You know? And I'm ashamed to say that I then proceeded to completely crash the possibility for dialogue by likening that position to a toothless medieval lay preacher who was roaming the countryside in 14th century Europe, spreading old wives' tales that it is the black magic of the Jews who are causing the plague. You know, in my view, it's a kind of a valid historical comparison, but I've learned that flashing intellectual disdain just enforces pipeline dynamics. Perhaps it even gets you labeled as some sort of centrist, normie, libtard, mainstream something. Yeah, so I don't have an answer for dealing with this paradox that your pushback against this shit often enforces the sense of counterculture. And it's why I think we probably need to sort of go deeper and look at culture in a wider sense. And I think we need to own counterculture back with high integrity knowledge. The left wing, for instance, has to get back some of its punk, But paradoxically, we also need to respect knowledge and suck up the paradox, bro. If we want to counter the one-on outright dynamics, then we need to get on that trickster paradox horse, because they are riding it and they're doing it much better than the adults. And I know that affecting culture sounds like a huge thing, but perhaps we should think about this on a local level in our, circle of friends. Bring in values that counteract the one-on. So this knowledge, or perhaps anti-knowledge, that you find in one-on spaces, it often misrepresents academia, high integrity knowledge, with this really harmful binary where scholarship is reduced to a mainstream and opposed to this heroic freedom fighters of the non-mainstream knowledge. And that idea is cultist guru bullshit. A good example is, again, Graham Hancock with his IHH Civilizations, whose material I had a bit of a run-in with recently. So his manipulative strategy totally relies on sending very contradictory signals. It's very trickster. On the one hand, he rubs shoulders with scholarship all the time in order to sort of communicate high integrity by imitating scholarship. In this, for instance, in his referencing style of name-dropping researchers and journals and research articles, and even portraying himself on photos with researchers. He does it all the time. While, paradoxically, he reduces actual scholarship to this mainstream as a mode of casting himself as this illustrious, oppressed rebel for the truth, right? And this is a really malignant style of manipulation that I think we need to vaccinate culture against, pun intended, One really strong recommendation, I think, is to apply scholarship for counterculture. Scholarship produces integrity knowledge because it grows from old and deeply rooted cultural dialogues. We are literally still in dialogues initiated by Hellenic philosophers in Athens, and exactly because scholarship is a social human dialogue, it's not perfect, of course. It's human, it's filled with flaws and contradictions and tensions and irreconcilable oppositions, conflicts, even revolutions in how we understand the world. Scholarship has even been weaponized in really harmful ways, but scholarship is not, for instance, inherently colonial, like some people like to say, for the simple reason that it's much, much older than colonialism. So real counterculture actually grows from the base of high integrity knowledge. And when scholarship, as an example of that, is at its best, it's a trickster voice, actually, that always angles out, it inverts, it questions the normative positions. It challenges the given assumptions that underlies our culture and our community. But it grows this thinking from roots with integrity, not this manipulative bullshit like entertaining ideas of prehistoric Atlantis and under the cover of being in opposition to this idiotic idea of the mainstream. So a really strong recommendation of mine is the American anthropologist David Graeber, who, for instance, talk about prehistory in ways that challenge our basic assumptions about the roots of Western culture and about humanity as a whole and about how human civilization works. Perhaps we Westerners got really important elements in what we understand as enlightenment and democracy, not from the Greeks, but from indigenous Americans. What? Amazing insight. Political agency in many different ways have, in fact, perhaps always been part of human culture. Stuff like parliamentarism and equality are not new inventions. This is an incredibly empowering understanding that Graeber suggests. So why is it, I really asked myself, why would anyone interested in prehistory look at these two books here, one by Graeber and one by Graham Hancock, and choose Hancock, who enforces exactly those deep perceptions, thereby disempowering us, claiming that that is counter to mainstream, amazingly succeeding to talk about both mythology and history in ways that are so exquisitely dysfunctional that he convolutes both. Now, one part of the explanation for this choice is that high integrity knowledge is indeed less captivating, it's less clickbaity than low or non-integrity knowledge like Hancock, which is free from the constraints and the methods of our knowledge culture, and therefore it's free to focus exclusively on being entertaining. But still, yeah, Graeber does require a slightly longer attention span than Hancock, but only slightly. Graeber's Dawn of Everything is super well communicated. I experienced it as an actual page turner. So I think there's another important reason for this choice, and that is social. We are missing this mentoring space that you have in any knowledge tradition, including Western academia. When people navigate info on the internet, they are lulled into this clickbait mindset. But if you're in an institution of education, knowledge holder will guide you. So you invest your reading and your time in good stuff and don't waste your resources on bullshit. And there's loads of space, for instance, in universities to be wild and to be explore radical thinking and counterculture. I totally did that, but that personal, real-life mentoring contact, it still keeps you rooted in high-integrity knowledge. And this is why I think that one really effective response to the growth of war on fascism is the Nordic folk school model, a broad movement for grassroots education where there is this real-life contact. Mentorship is available for learners so they don't waste valuable life on shit. And of course, a folk school is a big thing, let alone a movement. But we can start small, We have a book club in the Nordic Animism Patreon site, that people can participate in, and where we know that we do good stuff with people. Notice, by the way, that David Graeber was an anarchist. He was one of the founders of the Occupy Wall Street movement, a very political person. And I think we should generally insist that counterculture is political. So this New Age woo-woo story that you sometimes meet of free spirits that are floating in serene purity somewhere way above the hands-dirtying, frighteningly gritty realness of being political, well, that is political in itself, and often it seems to end as a cover for being political in really disgusting ways. I'm above politics, but I think Kamala Harris is a really bad choice. The Jews designed COVID and Islam is evil. And this also connects back to counterculture. I think we need to own back political counterculture. And that implies some reflection on how exactly leftist politics went and became so radically un-punk. And that implies realizing that leftist politics have gone and become un-punk, which for some reason lefties sometimes have trouble acknowledging. If you say it, they're like, yeah, that's what the right-wingers are saying. Yeah, if the right-wingers are saying that people are hungry because they're hungry, then take seriously that people are hungry. So summing up, I think that the movement for animism and traditional knowledge back to land needs a couple of things. One, we need to acknowledge and insist on that what we say and think is never immune to fascist appropriation. That's the starting point. Two, we need to learn how to counter dysfunctional knowledge through personal relational learning to replace this emotive clickbait as a criteria for information here in the post-truth era. The Nordic folk school movement, other forms of getting together around knowledge, might be a way to go. And I think we need to bring together some elements that are sometimes contradictory. And in order to do that, to hold contradiction, I think we need some of this trickster playfulness that the right wing has stolen from us. But we also need to insist on knowledge with integrity. Trickster, integrity knowledge, almost there's a bit of a tension paradox there itself, right? We need to grow counterculture from integrity knowledge, like David Graeber's thinking. There are probably many others, I've just used him as an example. We need to stand with anti-authoritarianism and freedom, but also insist on social politics. We need to bring punk back, but also acknowledge those positions of social power that activist struggles of previous generations have afforded us. We not just give them up because it's important for our own self-image that we are, these oppressed rebels all the time. So yes, let's get together and bring awareness of the Wu on, and let's resist this extremely dangerous and harmful tendency in our culture and in our time. Thanks for listening, and see you around.